What if everything you believed about getting old was wrong? Henry stared at the flickering television screen in his dimly lit living room, the weight of his 68 years pressing down like the thick summer heat seeping through the cracked windowpane. The news anchor was talking about Elon Musk's newest project, a secret tunnel being dug underneath the city that promised to transform how people moved, worked, and connected. Henry's eyes didn't quite believe it. A man with the audacity to dream big in a world that seemed to have no place for dreamers his age or older. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in around him as the familiar ache in his knees reminded him of every missed chance, every faded hope that had slipped through his fingers. He looked down at the worn hands resting on his lap, hands that once built engines, fixed cars, and crafted solutions. Now, they trembled slightly, unused, forgotten. Henry let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, a breath mingled with regret and a surprising spark of curiosity. What if Elon Musk was right? What if the only thing standing between him and a new life was the courage to take a step, no matter how small? Outside, the evening sun bled orange over the quiet town, and somewhere deep inside, a flicker of something old but powerful stirred, hope. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Henry had felt invisible for years, like a ghost drifting through his own life. His daughter had stopped calling regularly, his old friends were scattered like leaves in the wind, and the world seemed to move faster every day while he stood still. The kitchen was cluttered with unopened mail and fading photos. His prized toolbox sat untouched on a shelf gathering dust, a silent reminder of a younger self who had once believed in possibility. Tonight, something shifted. The words from Elon Musk's interview played over in his mind: when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. The idea echoed louder than the silence around him. Could it be that even now, after everything, it wasn't too late to matter? Henry's heart quickened, and with trembling fingers, he reached for his phone. For the first time in years, he opened a new document and began to type, a single sentence at first: "Today is the day I stop waiting." Outside, the stars blinked awake, scattered across the vast American sky, and in that small, lonely living room, a quiet revolution began. This was no longer just a story about a tunnel beneath the city. It was a story about digging deeper, about breaking through the barriers of age, fear, and doubt. For Henry, and maybe for you, too, this was the moment everything changed. Henry's life before this moment was a quiet mosaic of missed chances and fading echoes. Born and raised in a small Midwestern town, he had spent most of his days working as a mechanic in a garage that smelled of oil and metal, a place where he felt alive and useful. The neighborhood was filled with faces he had known since childhood, but as the years passed, those faces had grown fewer and more distant. The house he lived in was modest, a two-story frame with peeling paint and a porch that sagged under the weight of time, much like Henry himself. Inside, the rooms held memories that felt heavier now, the laughter of his late wife still whispering in the corners, the faint traces of his daughter's childhood art taped to the fridge, and the silence that came from a life that had slowed to a crawl. Henry often found himself staring at the old toolbox resting on a shelf in the garage, its lid closed tight but the promise inside it still palpable. It was his father's toolbox, passed down like a baton from one generation to the next, each dent and scratch a story of hard work and resilience. But now it sat mostly untouched, a symbol of the man Henry had been and the man he feared he was losing. His daughter, Emily, had moved away 5 years ago to chase her own dreams in a bustling city far from their quiet town. Their calls had grown sporadic, strained by distance and unspoken disappointments. Henry carried the weight of that silence heavily, regret curled around his chest like a vine, tightening with every missed conversation and every unanswered text. The doctor had told him to slow down after his last health scare, warning about his blood pressure and the stubborn stiffness in his joints. "Take it easy," the nurse had said with a gentle smile that felt more like a warning. But Henry had never been good at taking it easy. The truth was, he felt lost, invisible, like a shadow fading into the background of a world that no longer needed him. He woke up most mornings with a dull ache, the kind that settled deep into the bones and whispered reminders of years gone by. Some days, the loneliness was a physical weight, pressing down so hard he could barely move. There was a particular memory that haunted him most, a summer evening decades ago when he and his wife, Mary, had danced barefoot on the porch beneath the stars, their laughter echoing into the warm night air. That night was the promise of everything to come: love, family, dreams. But life had a way of unraveling those promises. Mary's passing 5 years earlier had left a silence so vast it swallowed Henry whole. He remembered how, after her death, the house had felt too big, the walls closing in like a cold trap. The garden she tended with such care had wilted without her hands to nurture it. Henry had retreated into routine and solitude, afraid to confront the emptiness that her absence left behind. On the kitchen table, a framed photo showed Henry, Mary, and a small Emily, all smiles and sunlit joy. He touched the glass gently, as if he could reach through time and hold them again. The weight of lost love and lost time bore down on him. The years had not been kind. Henry's body bore the marks of decades of labor, the calloused hands, the stooped back, the slow, measured steps that replaced the brisk walk he used to take. His eyesight had blurred slightly, and the mirror showed a face lined with worry and wear. Yet, beneath all that, there was still a flicker of the man who had once dreamed of more. The dreams had shifted, of course. When he was young, Henry had wanted to build things, to create something that mattered. He had imagined a life filled with adventure and discovery. But life had a way of steering him down different roads, roads paved with sacrifice and responsibility. Raising Emily alone after Mary's death had consumed much of his energy and heart, leaving little room for his own hopes. His relationship with Emily had suffered under the weight of grief and distance. Their last argument over a missed phone call lingered painfully in his mind. "You never make time for me anymore, Dad," she had said, her voice tinged with frustration and hurt. Henry hadn't known how to respond. The silence that followed was louder than any words. For years, Henry felt trapped by these memories, a prisoner of his own past. He tried to fill the void with routine, fixing neighbors' cars, maintaining the house, tending to the garden Mary had loved. But each task felt hollow, a shadow of what once brought him joy. And yet, somewhere beneath the fatigue and regret, a small ember remained. It was that ember that stirred when he heard about Elon Musk's tunnel project on the news. The idea that one man, in his late 40s and early 50s, was defying the odds, challenging the world's expectations, and pushing forward despite setbacks, it sparked something Henry hadn't felt in years: possibility. Could a man like Elon Musk really change the world? And if so, could Henry still change his own life? The question echoed inside him, mingling with memories and regrets, but also with hope. The night deepened around his small home as Henry sat alone with these thoughts. The silence was thick, but this time it felt different, less like a tomb and more like a quiet invitation. He remembered his father's words from long ago: "Son, it's never too late to start digging. You just gotta find the right spot." For the first time in years, Henry felt that maybe the right spot wasn't buried deep underground or hidden in a distant city, it was right here, within himself. The story of Elon Musk's tunnel wasn't just about engineering or technology. It was about breaking through barriers, about courage, about daring to build a new path when all seemed lost. Henry closed his eyes and let the memory of dancing on the porch with Mary wash over him. Maybe, just maybe, the music hadn't stopped. Maybe there was still a chance to dance again. And with that thought, a quiet determination settled into his heart. Tomorrow, he decided, would be different. Tomorrow, he would start small. He would open the toolbox, dust off the memories, and take the first step toward rediscovering the man he had almost forgotten he was. Because even in the quietest lives, there is a moment waiting to change everything. Henry just needed to find his. Henry sat on the worn-out couch, the dim light from the lamp casting long shadows across the room, and he felt the weight of the question pressing down on him like a heavy fog: was it too late? For years, that question had haunted him. Was his time truly behind him? Was he just a relic, a man whose best days were buried in the past like the old photographs gathering dust on the mantel? The silence in his house was suffocating, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards or the distant hum of a passing car. His mind raced with doubts and fears, each one louder than the last. The doctor's words echoed again, "You need to slow down, Henry. At your age, you have to be careful." But slowing down felt like surrendering, and surrendering wasn't something Henry had ever been good at. His daughter, Emily, had called earlier that day. Her voice was distant, polite but cautious. "Dad, I'm worried about you. You can't just keep pushing like this. Maybe it's time to accept things as they are." That phrase, "accept things as they are," felt like a punch to the gut. Did she really believe he was done? That his story had run its course? Henry closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Inside him, a war raged. The part of him that wanted to give up and the part that refused to let go. He remembered scrolling through his phone earlier that afternoon, aimlessly flicking through news articles and social media. Then, he stumbled across a podcast featuring Elon Musk. The man's voice was calm but firm, filled with conviction. When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. The quote struck Henry like a bolt of lightning, illuminating a path through the fog of his despair. Elon Musk, the visionary entrepreneur, was defying expectations every day. Age, failure, fear, none of it stopped him. Musk's words reminded Henry of a time when he believed anything was possible. Back when he was young, with the world spread out before him like an uncharted map. But the world had changed, and so had he. He was no longer the man who could work under a car hood for hours or ride his bike for miles without exhaustion. The years had taken their toll, and the body that once carried him effortlessly now ached with every movement. Yet, despite all that, Elon's words sparked something stubborn inside Henry, a flicker of rebellion against the idea that he was done. The night crept on, but Henry couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the podcast in his mind, Elon's relentless pursuit of innovation and progress. What if he could find his own way to push forward? What if the tunnel Elon was building beneath the city was more than just a project? What if it was a metaphor for breaking through the barriers in his own life? Henry's mind wandered to the skeptical voices around him. The doctor's advice to slow down, Emily's worry-laden caution, the neighbors who looked at him as if he were fading away, invisible and irrelevant. But Elon didn't care about the odds or the skeptics. He carved his own path, no matter the obstacles. The question wasn't whether Henry could do something new at his age, but whether he was willing to try. A sudden knock at the door startled Henry from his thoughts. It was Mrs. Jenkins, his next-door neighbor, holding a basket of freshly baked cookies. "Thought you might like some company," she said with a warm smile. Henry forced a smile back, grateful yet embarrassed by his own isolation. As she sat down, Henry felt the conversation shift to the usual small talk, but beneath the surface was a shared understanding of growing older, of feeling invisible in a world obsessed with youth. "You know, Henry," Mrs. Jenkins said softly, "sometimes it feels like the world's moving too fast, and we're just left behind. But maybe it's not about keeping up, but finding our own pace." Her words lingered with Henry as she left, the cookies a sweet reminder that he wasn't completely alone. That night, he sat by the window, watching the city lights twinkle like distant stars. Somewhere below the surface, Elon's tunnel was slowly being carved, a testament to perseverance and vision. Henry felt a rising storm inside him, the fear of failure, the ache of loneliness, the doubt of whether anyone cared about what he might still become. But alongside that storm was a glimmer of hope, fragile yet undeniable. The inner war was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, Henry felt ready to fight. He opened his laptop and searched for local community groups and workshops, anything that might connect him with people and purpose. The screen glowed softly in the dark room, a portal to possibilities he had forgotten existed. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. Could he really do this? Could he step out of the shadows of his own life and carve a new tunnel to something better? The answer was unclear, but the question itself was a start. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, its own doubts. But tonight, Henry allowed himself a moment of courage. To believe that even at 68, he could still matter. That the story wasn't finished. That the tunnel, both beneath the city and within himself, was waiting to be dug. The next morning dawned cool and clear, sunlight spilling over the worn roof of Henry's house like a fresh invitation. For the first time in weeks, Henry felt a stirring of something unfamiliar, possibility. The ache in his knees was still there, stubborn and persistent, but it no longer felt like a wall. It was more like a challenge. Today, he told himself quietly, today I start. He pushed himself off the couch and shuffled toward the garage, that dusty cavern where his father's old toolbox waited silently on a high shelf. It was covered in a fine layer of grime, the year's worth of neglect weighing heavily on it. Henry grabbed a step stool and reached up, pulling it down carefully. The metal was cold in his hands, heavier than he remembered, but it felt real, a connection to a past when he believed in building, fixing, and creating. He set the box on a workbench cluttered with forgotten tools, rusted screws, and a faded photograph taped to the wall, a picture of him and Mary standing beside an old bike, laughing under a summer sun. The bike itself had been stored in the corner of the garage for years, a relic of a dream unfulfilled. Henry had always wanted to ride it cross-country, a journey he imagined would set his spirit free, but life had always gotten in the way. Today, something inside him shifted. Maybe he couldn't change the past, but he could still move forward, one small step at a time. He opened the toolbox, the hinges creaking softly, and started pulling out wrenches, screwdrivers, and oil cans. The smell of metal and grease was strangely comforting, a scent that brought memories rushing back, long days of hard work, the satisfaction of fixing something broken, the pride of hands well used. As he cleaned and organized the tools, Henry felt the dust of years lift from more than just the garage. It was like clearing a space inside himself, making room for something new. The bike in the corner caught his eye again. He wheeled it out into the sunlight, its faded paint chipped but still sturdy. With careful hands, he began to inspect the chain, the tires, the brakes. Each part needed attention, just like him. The work was slow and deliberate, each twist of the wrench a small victory. Outside, the neighborhood was stirring to life, birds chirped, a lawn mower rumbled in the distance, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the open window. Henry's muscles ached from the unfamiliar movement, but his heart felt lighter than it had in years. He paused to wipe sweat from his brow, looking around the garage that felt less like a tomb and more like a workshop of possibilities. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Later that afternoon, Henry sat on the porch, the bike propped beside him. He pulled out his phone and took a photo, the sunlight catching the glint of freshly cleaned chrome and rubber. With hesitant fingers, he sent the picture to Emily, adding a simple message, fixing something old. Thinking of you. The reply came quicker than he expected. Dad, this is amazing. Proud of you. The words hit him like a bomb, softening years of distance and regret. It was a small spark, but enough to ignite hope. Over the next few days, Henry made the bike repair a ritual. Each morning, he worked for a little while, pushing past aches and fatigue. He researched routes online, found local biking groups, and even looked up beginner exercises to build his strength. The act of fixing, of building, was transforming something deep inside him. It wasn't about the bike alone. It was about reclaiming a part of himself he thought lost. One evening, Henry tuned back into the podcast with Elon Musk. This time, he listened more intently, absorbing the mindset of fearless innovation and relentless drive. Musk's voice was like a beacon, encouraging Henry to dream bigger, to break through the barriers of age and doubt. If something is truly important, you find a way, Musk said. Henry repeated the words quietly to himself, feeling them settle like a seed ready to grow. He realized the tunnel Musk was building beneath the city wasn't just a physical project, it was a metaphor for life, digging through obstacles, creating new pathways where none seemed possible. Inspired, Henry made a decision. He would not just fix a bike, he would reconnect. The next day, he drafted a letter to Emily, pouring out his heart in words that had been trapped for too long. He wrote about his regrets, his hopes, and the small steps he was taking to find his way again. He told her about the bike, about the podcast, about how he was beginning to believe in new beginnings. Sending the letter was terrifying, but Henry felt a quiet relief afterward. The act of reaching out was its own kind of transformation. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, Henry's routine expanded. He joined a local community center for seniors, attending gentle exercise classes and meeting people who, like him, were searching for meaning in the chapters of life they hadn't expected to write. The faces were familiar, some filled with doubt, others with resilience, but all shared the common thread of wanting to matter. Henry found himself sharing his story, the inspiration he drew from Musk's relentless spirit, and the small triumph of repairing an old bike. His story became a beacon for others who felt stuck or forgotten. One afternoon, as Henry wheeled the bike outside for a gentle ride around the block, he noticed a group of children playing in the park. Their laughter echoed through the air, vibrant and alive. For a moment, he envied their boundless energy, but then he reminded himself that energy took many forms. His journey was slower, quieter, but no less powerful. Each pedal stroke was a reclaiming of his strength, each breath a testament to endurance. Henry's confidence grew, not just in his body but in his spirit. The skepticism of others, the worried glances, the whispered doubts, no longer held power over him. He had taken the first step, and that was enough. The bike, once a forgotten dream, was now a symbol of transformation. It represented the courage to change, to push against the limits imposed by age and circumstance. Inspired by Musk's example, Henry began to dream again, not of grand, world-changing inventions, but of simple acts that mattered. Reconnecting with his daughter, sharing his story, and finding joy in the present. The garage that had once felt like a tomb was now a workshop of hope, and the tunnel beneath the city became a metaphor for the path he was digging within himself. Each day was a new opportunity, each challenge a chance to prove that he was not done yet. Henry knew there would be setbacks, the ache in his knees would remind him of his limits, and the fear of failure would lurk in the shadows. But he had learned that the most important thing was to keep moving forward, no matter how small the steps. That was the secret. That was the change. And in that change, Henry found a new beginning. The morning air had a crispness that hinted at the slow turn of seasons, and as Henry wheeled the freshly repaired bike to the edge of the driveway, a sense of nervous excitement buzzed just beneath his skin. Today was the day. For weeks he'd circled the block, pedaling carefully, learning his new limits, building back strength he thought had left him for good. But now, he was ready to go farther, to push beyond the invisible perimeter that had kept his life small. The route he had chosen wasn't long by anyone else's standards, just 4 miles to the next town's park, but for Henry, it was Everest. He checked the brakes again, adjusted his helmet, and took a long, calming breath. His heart beat a little faster, not just from nerves but from the sheer reality of motion, of doing something new, something hard. He pushed off gently, and the wheels responded with smooth grace. His knees complained immediately, but he ignored them, focusing instead on the wind brushing against his cheeks and the rhythmic click of the chain. The world opened up around him, green lawns, sleepy sidewalks, birds darting through trees. It wasn't just a bike ride. It was a return. A reclamation. A small child waved as he passed. A dog barked at a fence. The ordinary world suddenly looked full of color, as if someone had turned the saturation back on in a movie that had been gray for too long. Henry smiled through the strain. Each pedal was effort. Each breath, resistance. But inside that resistance was something powerful, proof that he was not done, not finished, not invisible. And then, halfway through the ride, at the top of a small hill, his right leg cramped. Hard. The pain shot through him like lightning, and he was forced to stop, hands gripping the handlebars to steady himself as he panted, sweat suddenly slick on his brow. Doubt hit him like a wave. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe Emily was right. Maybe the doctor knew better. He looked down the hill, the road stretching ahead and mocking him with its distance. The sun beat down on his neck. The breeze turned cold. Everything in him wanted to turn back. But just then, a car passed, a sleek, silent electric car, and the sticker on the back window caught his eye. It was just one line, "Still learning. Still building." Henry stared at it. Something about it felt familiar. A quote, maybe. Elon Musk's words again, echoed through podcasts and interviews. Still learning. Still building. He stood there, leg throbbing, and repeated it aloud. Still learning. Still building. That was it, wasn't it? Not about doing things perfectly, not about being the strongest or the fastest, but about staying in motion. About continuing to build even if the materials were different now, not engines and bolts, but strength, purpose, and connection. With slow, deliberate breaths, Henry massaged his leg, drank from the water bottle in his pack, and climbed back onto the bike. It hurt, but he pedaled anyway. Down the hill, along the quiet road, until the trees parted and the park emerged in the distance like a victory banner. He coasted to a stop beside a bench and sat heavily, chest heaving, legs trembling. But he had made it. For miles. Alone. At 68. And in that moment, the pain didn't matter. The doubt didn't matter. He took a selfie, red-faced, smiling, the bike behind him, and sent it to Emily. This time, no caption. Just the image. It spoke for itself. A minute passed. Then another. And then her reply buzzed on his phone, "Wow. I'm proud of you, Dad. Seriously." He stared at the words. Read them again. And again. Tears welled in his eyes, not from the physical strain but from the deeper pain being soothed. He had wondered for so long if she still cared. If his life still meant anything to anyone. And now he had an answer, clear and simple. The ride back home was slower, harder, but every turn of the pedals felt lighter in spirit. When he reached his driveway, the sun was low, casting long golden shadows across the neighborhood. He leaned the bike against the garage and stood in the glow, letting the moment soak in. That night, Henry sat at the kitchen table, dinner untouched, scrolling through local forums on his laptop. Something inside him, a boldness he hadn't felt in years, nudged him forward. He opened a new thread titled, "Reclaiming Purpose at 68, My Ride Back." He posted the picture. Shared the story. Nothing dramatic. Just honest. Real. Within an hour, comments began trickling in. People thanking him. Sharing their own stories. One man, 72, wrote, "Been thinking of dusting off my canoe. Maybe tomorrow." A woman in her 60s replied, "My garden's been neglected. Maybe I'll start again." Henry leaned back in his chair, stunned. All he had done was ride a bike. But that simple act had rippled out like a dropped stone in still water. It wasn't the bike. It was the decision to move. To try. To believe. For so long he'd thought of inspiration as something for the young. Something loud and bright and filled with adrenaline. But this quiet, aching, beautiful breakthrough, was just as powerful. He opened the podcast again, Elon's voice filling the space. People underestimate what they can do in a year. They overestimate what they can do in a week. Just keep building. Henry closed his eyes. This was what building looked like now. Not with steel and wires, but with breath, sweat, heart. The next morning, he woke sore but smiling. The ache was different now, earned. He brewed coffee, sat on the porch, and let the morning sun wash over him. Something had shifted. Something deep. He wasn't back, not in the way people meant when they said that. But he was forward. He had moved forward. That evening, Emily called. Not a text, not a short reply, a full conversation. I couldn't stop looking at that picture, Dad, she said. You looked different. Like yourself again. I felt like myself again, he replied, voice catching. She told him about her job, her struggles, her own doubts about life. And for the first time in years, he listened without guilt or distraction. They talked for almost an hour, laughter mingled with silence that didn't feel heavy. When they hung up, Henry sat in the quiet, overwhelmed by gratitude. The tunnel beneath the city was still being built, miles of dark passage slowly taking shape, just like the one within him. But light had found its way in. Not because someone gave it to him. Not because Elon Musk swooped in with a miracle. But because Henry had picked up a wrench, fixed a bike, and dared to believe in motion again. And that, more than anything, was the breakthrough. Henry stood in front of the community center's notice board, squinting slightly against the glare of the afternoon sun. The scent of cut grass and sun-warmed pavement filled the air as children's laughter echoed from the nearby playground. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper, and pinned it up with one hand. In bold black letters across the top, it read, Second Wind Riders, weekly meetup for riders 60 and up. Beneath it was a simple invite, bring your bike, your story, and your curiosity. No experience needed. No judgment given. He stepped back, staring at the flyer. A month ago, he would have never imagined doing this. A month ago, he'd been on that couch, watching the world pass him by, convinced that the rest of his life was just a slow wait for the end. Now he was forming a group. A group of people like him, people who needed a reason to believe they weren't done yet. The idea had taken root shortly after his breakthrough ride. After posting his story online and getting dozens of replies from strangers who, like him, were yearning to matter again, Henry realized something: this wasn't just about him. There were others. Hundreds, maybe thousands, living in the same quiet resignation. Maybe they just needed someone to take the first step. So he did. He called the community center, offered to host a low-pressure bike meetup once a week. Just a ride, he'd said, just to get us out of the house and into the world again. The woman on the phone, Joanne, had chuckled softly and replied, "You'd be surprised how many people ask for something like that but never actually follow through. I like you, Henry. You're doing it." He hadn't been sure anyone would come. But that first Saturday morning, 2 people showed up. A wiry man in his 70s named Bill who hadn't ridden in 20 years, and a shy widow named Linda who brought her old Schwinn with a basket and flowers tied to the handlebars. They talked more than they rode, sharing stories over coffee after a slow, cautious circle around the park. But it was enough. The next week, 4 more joined. Then 7. Now, almost a month in, they were averaging a dozen people: retired teachers, widowed grandparents, a quiet man who had once been an airline mechanic, a former nurse who hadn't left her house for anything besides groceries in years. They all came for the ride, but stayed for the connection. It wasn't just about the bikes. It was about the stories they shared while rolling down quiet roads, about the laughs at the corner diner afterward, about remembering how good it felt to do something with other people again. Henry rode at the front, not as a leader, but as someone who had simply gone first. And when someone asked what had gotten him started, he'd smile and tell the truth: a podcast. Elon Musk said something about doing what matters even if the odds aren't in your favor. I believed him. And people listened. They didn't laugh. They didn't roll their eyes. They nodded. Because deep down, they wanted to believe that too. That they weren't just waiting to disappear. That they still had something to build. Something to offer. On the 3rd Saturday, after a ride that took them all the way to the lake, Linda sat on a bench beside Henry, breathing deep and watching the water shimmer. "You know," she said quietly, I hadn't talked to anyone besides my cat in 3 weeks before I came to this. I didn't realize how lonely I was until I wasn't. Henry felt that. Deeply. It's like waking up, he said. Not suddenly. Slowly. But fully. She nodded, her eyes misty. It matters. That phrase echoed in Henry's chest as he rode home. It matters. So much of his life had felt like background noise after Mary passed. Like he was existing, not living. But this new chapter, this second wind, was breathing life into corners of his heart that had been quiet for years. That night, he sat at his desk, opened a blank document, and began typing. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't a post. It was a manifesto. A small one. Just a page. But it held everything he'd come to believe. That aging wasn't decline, it was adaptation. That relevance wasn't reserved for the young. That purpose wasn't about scale, but about motion. And at the top, he titled it, The New Legacy. In it, he wrote about his journey, from the quiet despair of believing life had passed him by, to the simple decision to fix a bike, to the moment he realized that helping others rediscover motion gave his life more meaning than anything he'd done before. He didn't know who would read it, or if it would matter. But writing it was like breathing for the first time after holding his breath too long. And when he was done, he printed 5 copies, folded them, and placed them into envelopes. One he left at the community center. One he mailed to his doctor. One he handed to the nurse who had told him to slow down. One he set aside for the next person who joined the ride. And one, the final copy, he sealed in a small wooden box in his closet labeled simply, For Emily. Because this, he knew now, wasn't just about him. It was about legacy. Not in the sense of grand inheritance or monuments, but in the stories we leave behind. The courage we model. The small, stubborn acts of resistance against invisibility. The next week, Emily visited. In person. She parked on the curb, suitcase in hand, eyes bright but hesitant. You look stronger, she said, hugging him. I feel stronger, he replied. Over dinner, she asked questions about the group, the rides, the people. She listened, really listened. And when Henry showed her the bike, polished and proud, she teared up. I missed this version of you, she said quietly. I missed him too, Henry replied. They talked late into the night. About Mary. About the years they'd lost. And about the ones still ahead. Before bed, he handed her the envelope with The New Legacy inside. She read it silently, then looked at him and said, You should publish this. People need this. Henry chuckled. Who'd listen to an old guy with sore knees and a garage full of rust? A lot more than you think, she said. You found a way through the tunnel. Maybe you can help others find theirs. He didn't sleep much that night. Not because of pain, but because of possibility. He dreamt of a city lit from underneath, not by literal tunnels, but by the people who dared to dig deep into themselves and rediscover what had been buried. Strength. Joy. Hope. Relevance. Henry wasn't just writing anymore. He was leading. He wasn't just remembering. He was building. Still learning. Still building. That was the new legacy. And it was just getting started. The morning after Emily left, Henry stood at the window holding his coffee, the steam curling into the air as he watched the sun rise slow and amber over the rooftops. The house felt full for the first time in years, not because anyone else was there, but because something inside him had expanded. A quiet certainty had taken root. This wasn't just a phase. This was real. This was who he was now. The document he'd given Emily, the new legacy, had been meant just for her, but the moment she mentioned publishing it, something clicked. Henry had spent decades waiting for someone to tell him his voice still mattered. What if he didn't have to wait anymore? What if he gave himself permission? That afternoon, he sat back at the kitchen table with his old laptop, cracked open a new tab, and typed, "How to self-publish a short ebook." The process was easier than he'd expected. Platforms made it simple. He uploaded the document, added a short description, and chose a title, "The New Legacy." How a broken bike, a podcast, and a stubborn old man changed everything. He stared at the title for a moment, unsure if it was too much. Then he hit publish. It felt like dropping a letter in the world's mailbox without knowing who it was addressed to. That night, he went to sleep with no expectations. Just the quiet satisfaction of having done something that scared him. The next morning, an email awaited him. "Your book has received its first review." Henry blinked. His palms suddenly went clammy. He clicked. The review was short, "I'm 66. I thought my time was over. Thank you for reminding me it isn't." He sat there, blinking at the screen, heart thudding. One person. Just one. But it was enough. The dam broke. Over the next few days, more reviews trickled in. People from small towns in Ohio, retired engineers in Arizona, a woman from Brooklyn who said she hadn't been on a bike since '84 but now kept her walking shoes by the door. Henry couldn't believe it. This little PDF, barely more than a few pages, was reaching people. And they were reaching back. The community center asked if they could share it in their monthly newsletter. The bike shop down the road offered a discount to anyone who mentioned Second Wind Riders. A local radio station emailed, asking if Henry might be willing to do a phone interview. "It's just a little weekend segment," the producer wrote. "But we think your story might resonate." Henry stared at the email, then at the phone beside him. His first instinct was to say no. What did he know about interviews? He was just a guy with a bike and some regrets. But that wasn't true anymore. He was a guy who had moved. Who had gotten others to move. That had to count for something. He typed back one word, "Yes." The interview aired that Saturday. Henry sat in his garage as it played over the dusty radio he'd nearly thrown out. His voice sounded strange, older, deeper, real. But he liked how it sounded. Grounded. Honest. He talked about the pain of losing Mary. About feeling like time had quietly erased him. And about the moment something changed. It wasn't some big lightning bolt, he said on air. It was a quote. Elon Musk said, "When something's important enough, you do it even if the odds aren't in your favor." That stuck with me. So I started. Just fixed a bike. And that led me back to myself. The host was quiet a moment before replying, "Henry, I think you're helping a lot of people realize it's never too late to start building again." That weekend, 20 riders showed up for the group ride. 20. They spilled out onto the street like a small parade. Bells ringing. Tires humming. People laughing. Some had old bikes, others had fancy new e-bikes, and one gentleman rode a three-wheeled contraption with a radio taped to the frame. Henry led them with pride, the wind against his face, the street unfolding like a road map to possibility. After the ride, a woman named Carol approached him. She was quiet, shy, but her eyes held something fierce. "I read your book," she said. "I'm not a writer. Never was. But I used to paint. Haven't touched a brush in 20 years. Yesterday, I did. Just a flower. But I cried when I finished." "Thank you." Henry nodded, overwhelmed. "It's never about the bike," he said. "It's about motion." Over the next few weeks, more people joined, not just the rides, but the movement. That's what people were calling it now. Second Wind. Someone started a Facebook group. A retired vet in Utah shared photos of his homemade canoe restoration. A couple in Maine posted about restarting their community garden after reading Henry's story. The ripple was growing. Henry wasn't famous. He wasn't trying to be. But something about his story, its simplicity, its honesty, was cutting through the noise. And behind all of it, in the background like a steady drumbeat, was the voice of a man who had unknowingly lit the match, Elon Musk. His words, his mindset, his refusal to be defined by limits, had started this chain reaction. Not because he'd handed Henry a blueprint, but because he had modeled something bigger, a refusal to accept the word impossible. One morning, Henry received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a simple card. On the front, a tunnel, carved through rock. On the back, just a handwritten message: "You're not just digging through age, you're digging through fear. Keep going." Henry stared at it for a long time. Was it real? A prank? Maybe. But the handwriting was clean. The message unmistakable. Elon. Could it be? Maybe. Maybe not. But it didn't matter. The message itself was enough. He placed the card on his fridge, held in place by a magnet shaped like a bicycle. Every morning after that, it greeted him. You're not just digging through age, you're digging through fear. And every morning, he smiled. Because he understood now. That was the real tunnel. The one Elon was digging beneath the city. The one Henry had been digging inside himself. Through regret. Through loneliness. Through the thick walls of "it's too late." And on the other side of that tunnel was light. Not blinding, not flashy, but warm, steady. Like sunrise on the face of a man who had almost forgotten how it felt to be seen. One morning, as the group prepared for their biggest ride yet, Henry looked around at the people gathered, faces lined with time, eyes lit with possibility, and felt something solid settle inside his chest. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was leading. He was building. Still learning. Still building. That was the message now. Not just for him. For all of them. And the best part? They were just getting started. Beneath the buzz of streetcars and morning traffic, something extraordinary was happening far below the city. It was quiet work, the kind no one paid much attention to, but every day, machines drilled deeper, and workers in reflective vests passed silently through steel-framed tunnels that didn't exist a year ago. The city had changed above ground, yes, but the real transformation was happening in the dark. That's what struck Henry when he finally saw it with his own eyes. Emily had surprised him with the visit, an early birthday gift, she'd said. And brought him to the Musk Tunnel Project's Public Innovation Center. It was part museum, part operations room, and part viewing deck. Henry had followed the signs past displays of scale models, breakthroughs in urban transportation, and timelines of the boring machines that chewed through Earth with impossible efficiency. But it was the window at the end, a wide, clear pane looking into the active tunnel itself, that took his breath away. Down below, engineers moved with purpose. Machines glided on rails. Lights bounced off wet stone. The tunnel was round, smooth, and far bigger than he imagined. It didn't look like destruction. It looked like promise. They say this tunnel will cut across the whole city, Emily said, standing beside him, her voice reverent. 30 miles of clean transport. A whole new layer of connection. Henry nodded slowly, absorbing it. We build under what's broken. That's how change happens. Emily looked at him. That's a good line. You should write that down. But he didn't need to. The moment itself etched it into his bones. Because looking down at that tunnel, Henry realized he had done the same in his own life, not by tearing the past away, but by digging beneath it, making room for new purpose. That evening, back home, he sat in his garage, staring at the dusty blueprints tacked to the wall. Not literal blueprints, more like scribbles and sketches. Goals. Ideas. Things to try. Places to visit. Questions to answer. It was his second wind map, and he added a new one now, visit a city transformed by something impossible. Then he paused and wrote just below it. Become one of the people who make impossible things seem normal. The tunnel had stirred something deeper. Something more ambitious. It wasn't just about rides and community anymore. It was about impact. Reach. Showing others, millions of others, that building new life at any age was not only possible, but vital. He reopened the new legacy document and began expanding it. Not just more stories, but tools. Guides. Questions to ask yourself when you're stuck. Ideas for rekindling your purpose after 60. He called it Legacy 2.0, the blueprint beneath the surface. And this time, he didn't wait. He uploaded it again. Free. No marketing. Just a quiet offering to the internet. Within a day, his inbox filled with messages. A 70-year-old former architect in Oregon who started sketching again. A woman in Florida who had started a community yoga group in her building's parking lot. A message from a pastor in Kansas who said he'd used Henry's writing as the basis for a sermon titled, Keep Digging. The idea of the tunnel, both Musk's and Henry's, had caught fire. People were talking about it. People were living it. That weekend, during the biggest ride the Second Wind riders had ever done, over 30 people now, stretching down the road in a joyous, slow-moving train, a man pulled up in a Tesla, rolled down the window, and shouted, "You folks are legends." Henry laughed, breathless but happy. "We're just getting started." The group cheered. Laughed. Riders rang bells and waved. They weren't athletes. They weren't models of youth and fitness. But they were in motion. And that was the revolution. Afterward, over sandwiches at the park, Bill, the former aircraft mechanic who now rode every week without fail, turned to Henry and said, "You ever think this is bigger than you?" Henry swallowed, nodded. "I think it always was. I was just the first one desperate enough to try." Linda added, "You should go on a bigger stage. Talk about this. Inspire people who've never even heard of Second Wind." Henry shook his head. "I'm just a guy who fixed a bike. And Elon Musk is just a guy who built electric cars and tunneled under a city," Bill said. "People follow momentum. You've got it." That night, Henry considered it. A bigger stage? The idea terrified him. But so had getting on that bike the first time. So had fixing it. So had writing that book. The fear wasn't a stop sign anymore, it was a compass. If it scared him, maybe it meant he was heading in the right direction. He clicked through his inbox again and saw something new, a message from a regional TEDx organizer. Short. Direct. "We read the new legacy. We believe others should too. Interested in speaking?" Henry stared at it. TEDx? Him. He was no public speaker. He'd barely passed his college speech class. But that little voice. The same one that whispered in the garage, that said, "Fix the bike, write the letter, share your story," spoke again, "Say yes. Dig deeper." He replied with a shaky but confident, "Yes. Tell me where to show up." Weeks passed in a blur. Speech coaching. Rehearsals. New shirts. Emily helped him. So did the Second Wind riders. They held a mock event at the community center and clapped like it was Carnegie Hall. The big day came. The red circle on the stage. The lights. The silence before he began. And then, what if I told you that the best years of your life might not be behind you, but waiting quietly beneath you? He told them everything. The couch. The bike. Elon's voice in the dark. The tunnel, both literal and personal. The group rides. The stories. The breakthroughs. He ended with the image of the tunnel under the city. "Change doesn't happen on the surface," he said. It happens when you dig through the noise, the fear, the story you've been told about what age means. You dig until you find motion again. You dig until you break into the light. Standing ovation. People cried. Others stood in quiet awe. And somewhere in the back row, Emily wiped her eyes and smiled wider than he'd ever seen. The talk went online. Viral within days. News outlets picked it up. The retired man who started a movement. Second wind, the aging revolution begins in a garage. Elon Musk inspired this 68-year-old to transform his life. Here's what happened next. Henry was invited to podcasts, panels, even a brief spot on morning television. He said yes to what felt right. He said no to the noise. He didn't want fame. He wanted momentum. His inbox overflowed. A man from Sweden started a similar writing group. A woman in India translated the new legacy into Hindi. A former teacher in Georgia created second wind workshops for retired educators. The tunnel had gone global. Not Musk's tunnel, that would take years to finish. But Henry's tunnel, the one inside people, was cracking open, every day. And just like that, the city beneath the city, the one made of people rediscovering purpose, late in life, against the odds, was alive and growing. And Henry? He was just getting warmed up. Henry was at his kitchen table with a bowl of oatmeal and his usual cup of black coffee when the letter arrived. It came in an envelope with no stamp, no postmark, and no return address, just his name, handwritten in bold blue ink. At first, he thought it might be from someone local, maybe one of the new second wind writers who preferred the old-fashioned way of communicating. But when he opened it, unfolded the single page, and began reading, his hands started to tremble. Dear Henry. I saw your TEDx talk. One of my engineers forwarded it to me. I watched it twice. Once as a curious viewer, and once as a man who knows what it feels like to be underestimated, to be called too wild, too unrealistic, too late. You are doing something remarkable. And not because it's flashy or loud. But because it's human. You've reminded people that the frontier isn't always space. Sometimes it's inside us. Sometimes it's the courage to say, I'm not done yet. I don't write many letters. But I wanted you to know, your tunnel is just as important as mine. Keep digging. Elon. Henry read the letter 3 times. Then he placed it gently on the table, leaned back in his chair, and stared at the ceiling. For a long time, he didn't move. Not out of disbelief, but because something inside him had shifted, again. He had built all of this off the spark of a single quote, and now the man who spoke those words had spoken again, directly to him. Not as a billionaire or a celebrity, but as a peer. As someone who understood the mission. For all the interviews, the comments, the shared stories, this letter landed in a different way. Because it reminded him that what he was building mattered not just to those like him, but to those forging the future, too. Later that day, he told Emily about the letter. She was stunned, of course, then grinned and said, well, looks like you've got your co-pilot. I don't need a co-pilot, Henry said, half smiling. Just needed someone to nod from the cockpit and say, keep going. That weekend, he shared the letter with the second wind writers. He read it aloud after their usual ride, his voice steady despite the emotion in his chest. When he finished, the group was silent for a moment. Then Bill said, well, damn. If Elon Musk's watching, we better up our game. Everyone laughed, but it wasn't just a joke. They felt it, too. The sense that what they were doing, these weekend rides, the conversations, the slow but steady rediscovery of purpose, was becoming something bigger. They weren't just a support group. They were a movement. Henry knew he needed to evolve with it. He couldn't just lead bike rides and hope things would take care of themselves. He had to build an infrastructure for what was coming. So he started meeting with local officials, pitched them on creating second wind community programs. Not just bike rides, but storytelling circles, walking clubs, micro-mentorships where retirees could teach what they'd learned to younger generations. Some smiled politely and brushed him off. Others listened. A few even leaned in. One city council member, younger than Henry's daughter, said, "You've tapped into something. A generation ready to be reactivated. This could work." It wasn't long before Henry was invited to speak at a state innovation summit. Then a national aging conference. Then a global urban vitality forum in Toronto, where mayors and developers talked about how cities could better serve older citizens. Each time, Henry said the same thing in different ways. Don't just build for the young. Don't forget the people who built everything we stand on. They're not done. They're just waiting to be asked. Second wind chapters started popping up in other cities. Phoenix. Minneapolis. Charlotte. Some modeled themselves exactly after Henry's original ride group. Others adapted. Some didn't involve bikes at all, just conversation circles or idea labs. But the essence was the same: start moving, start building, no matter where you are in life. At home, Henry kept things simple. He still rode his bike every morning. Still sat at his garage workbench with his laptop, responding to emails from strangers who'd seen his talk, read his words, or heard about him through a friend. Some were in their 60s. Many in their 70s. A surprising number in their 80s and 90s. One man wrote from a veterans care home in Montana and said, "I haven't left this building in 3 years. But this week I asked for a wheelchair with better tires. I'm ready to roll." Henry printed that one and pinned it to the corkboard beside Elon's letter. One afternoon, after a rainy ride cut short, he sat drying off in the kitchen when Emily called with an idea. "You should come to the city for a bit," she said. "Not for an event. Just to see it. It's changing, Dad. You'd be surprised." He hadn't been downtown in over a year. Since before all this started. He didn't love cities, the noise, the congestion, but something about her voice made him pause. "Are you near the tunnel?" he asked. "I am," she said. "And they're offering public walkthroughs now. Not just from the viewing deck. You can go into the tunnel. I already booked us 2 spots." Henry chuckled. "You planned the whole thing before you even called me." "Guilty," she said. I want you to see what you've been building reflected in something real. You deserve that." The following week, Henry stood at the mouth of the tunnel wearing a hard hat and safety vest, his hands in his jacket pockets, heart hammering. The descent into the tunnel was steep at first, then leveled off. The space around him pulsed with quiet energy, fans humming, lights flickering, machinery moving behind barriers. He walked beside Emily in silence, overwhelmed. "This," she said softly, "is what it looks like when people believe in a different future." Henry nodded. "It's not the size. It's the direction." A young engineer recognized him as they walked past one of the work zones. "Are you, the guy from the second wind thing?" Henry smiled. "Guilty. I showed your talk to my dad," the engineer said. He started volunteering again. First time he's left the house for something other than groceries in years. Henry reached out, shook the young man's hand. "Tell him he's digging a tunnel, too." When they finally emerged, the light hit Henry's face and he closed his eyes, breathing deeply. It wasn't just a tour. It was a mirror. And what he saw was clear: this wasn't about age anymore. It wasn't about late-life inspiration or a few kind-hearted rides around town. This was transformation. The city had built a tunnel to move faster. Henry had built one to move deeper. Both had changed the terrain above them. And both, in their own way, had only just begun. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The air was cooler than usual, crisp with the early scent of fall, when Henry sat on his front porch with a yellow notepad resting on his lap. The street in front of him was quiet, the maple trees just beginning to blush orange at the edges. He sipped coffee slowly, letting his thoughts drift. The last few months had moved like a storm, the rides, the TEDx talk, Elon's letter, the tunnel visit, the global explosion of the second wind movement. It was all extraordinary, far beyond what he ever imagined that day he pulled his old bike out of the garage and whispered, "What if I'm not done yet?" But now the world was listening. And with that came a different kind of weight. Not pressure exactly, but a question. One he'd been circling around for weeks. What happens after me? Movements needed more than a spark. They needed structure. Something people could carry forward long after the founder stepped back. And Henry knew he wouldn't lead forever. His knees ached more now. His breath was just a little shorter at the top of the hill near the park. He was strong, but not invincible. And that was fine. That was human. So he made a plan. Not a retirement plan, he wasn't going anywhere. But a continuity plan. A way to pass the torch without putting out the flame. He called together the local second wind riders one Saturday after their usual loop. "Friends," he said, standing in the park beside their favorite picnic table, "this has grown beyond me. And it should. This movement isn't about one person. It's about all of us deciding not to disappear." They listened, eyes focused, some nodding, others watching silently. "I want to start training new chapter leaders," Henry continued. "Not just for biking groups, but for storytelling nights, walking clubs, mentoring circles, whatever fits your town, your people. I'll help however I can, but I want this thing to live on its own legs." Bill raised a hand, smiling. "Are you asking us to franchise?" Henry laughed. "I'm asking you to lead. And redefine what leadership looks like." Over the next month, they met every Saturday afternoon after their rides. Not just for coffee and stories anymore, now they brought notebooks. Ideas. Drafted charters. Created templates for how to start a second wind group anywhere in the country, or the world. Emily helped structure everything. She created an online hub, simple but elegant, where people could download toolkits, share success stories, and ask questions. It was grassroots at its finest. No corporate backing. No boardroom meetings. Just a growing network of people refusing to fade. Then came the email. A high school in Colorado. A 10th grade teacher named Mr. Cole had shown Henry's TEDx talk to his students as part of a unit on modern leadership. The response had shocked him. Dozens of students wrote essays. Not about aging. But about their grandparents. About people they loved who had stopped dreaming, and how they wanted to help them start again. Mr. Cole asked if Henry would consider a video call with the class. Henry said yes. It was surreal, seeing 30 young faces blinking back at him on a screen, some awkward, some engaged, all curious. He told them the story. The real one. The grief. The loneliness. The rusted bike. The Musk quote. The slow climb back into purpose. They asked questions. Honest ones. Weren't you scared? Did people laugh at you? What if you had failed? Henry smiled. I was scared. Some people did laugh. And I did fail, a bunch. But I kept going. Because doing something with your heart beats doing nothing with your fear. After the call, one student sent an email. I convinced my grandma to walk with me twice a week now. She used to say, "What's the point?" Now she says, "Where to next?" Thank you. That line stuck with Henry. Where to next? Because that was the thing. Purpose wasn't a destination. It was a direction. And now, more than ever, he wanted to build something that could steer people toward that direction long after he was gone. So he wrote another guide. Not a book. A blueprint. Second Wind, the living manual. It wasn't flashy. Just clear steps, stories, questions, and rituals for groups to follow, or reinvent. He printed 1,000 copies using donations from supporters who had quietly offered help over the months. No ads. No business pitch. Just tools. Each guide had a note tucked inside. This isn't about me. It's about you. Start something. Keep it moving. One person can change a room. A room can change a city. Still learning, still building. Henry. He mailed out 800 copies himself. The rest were handed out at rides, speaking events, and through the website Emily maintained. One afternoon, a letter arrived from a small town in Kentucky. It was written in careful cursive, the kind taught in school decades ago. Dear Mr. Henry. My name is Mavis. I'm 82. I never married. I've lived in the same house for 45 years. I read your guide. Then I walked next door and invited the woman I always waved to but never spoke with to have tea. She said yes. We now meet every Wednesday. Thank you for giving me back something to look forward to. Henry placed the letter beside the others, the growing wall of echoes in his garage. He called it the Tunnel Archive. Each one proof that something once buried had risen to the surface. And then, in a full-circle moment no one could have scripted, the city council announced a new initiative, a Second Wind Innovation District, built in the repurposed warehouse section of downtown, just blocks from where Musk's tunnel resurfaced. It would include a maker space for retirees to build or teach. A mentorship lab. An adaptive fitness trail. A storytelling pavilion. They wanted Henry to cut the ribbon. He stood there on opening day, holding the oversized scissors with shaking hands, looking out at hundreds of faces, gray hair and ponytails, walkers and wheelchairs, parents with young kids, teenagers with cameras. They weren't there to watch an old man open a building. They were there to witness a philosophy, a movement, take form in brick and mortar. When the ribbon fell, the crowd erupted. Henry stepped back, tears in his eyes. He whispered to Emily, standing beside him, this is what legacy feels like. She gripped his hand and nodded. And it's still just the beginning. Because the truth was, he had no plans to slow down. He had miles left to ride, people left to meet, stories left to write. But now, for the first time, he didn't worry about what would happen when he stopped. Because the tunnel was open. The city had changed. And people were walking through, eyes forward, hearts open, ready for whatever came next. The first time Henry heard it, he wasn't even sure what it was. A low hum, almost melodic, pulsing gently beneath his feet as he stood on the sidewalk waiting for a crosswalk signal to change. He looked down, half expecting to see construction or a passing train, but there was nothing, just pavement, quiet traffic, and the faraway sound of a child laughing. Then he remembered, the tunnel. Musk's tunnel. It had officially opened 2 weeks earlier for limited use testing. Select rideshare vehicles, automated electric shuttles, and quiet transit pods now glided through the tunnel 20 stories below, cutting across the city like an underground artery. What Henry heard wasn't noise, it was movement. Progress. The sound of a city learning to flow again. He stepped off the curb with a smile. For a moment, he imagined the older version of himself, the man he used to be, standing on this same corner just a year ago. Tired, uncertain, waiting for time to pass him by. And now here he was, moving through a city transformed, not just by machines, but by mindset. Back home, Henry received a call from a voice he hadn't heard in a long time. Dad? It was Jeremy, his son. Henry straightened. Jeremy. Hey. You okay? Yeah. Yeah, I'm fine. I've been seeing your name a lot lately. He laughed nervously. You're kind of famous, you know. Henry smiled. It's not fame. It's motion. Jeremy was quiet for a second. Then, I watched your TEDx talk. Twice. Henry felt a lump rise in his throat. You did? I had to pull over the first time. Didn't expect it to hit me that hard. There was silence. Then Jeremy said, I think I owe you an apology. No, son, Henry said, voice soft. I think I owed myself one first. Another pause. Then Jeremy's voice, gentle, can I come visit? Henry looked out the window, eyes welling. The door's always open. Jeremy arrived that weekend, flying in from Denver. Older than Henry remembered, not in a bad way, just life-worn, like they both were. They hugged longer than either expected. No words needed. Over coffee, they talked about everything, Mary, the years lost, the walls they both had built. I guess I thought you didn't care anymore, Jeremy admitted. I thought the same, Henry said. Turns out we were both just scared to be wrong. Jeremy nodded. I don't want to waste any more time. Neither did Henry. That afternoon, they went for a walk, not a ride, just a slow stroll through the neighborhood where Jeremy had grown up. They passed the park where Henry had taught him to throw a baseball. The diner they used to visit on Saturdays. The old theater, now a bookstore. Everything familiar. Everything changed. That night, Jeremy joined the Second Wind Riders for their usual Sunday loop. He borrowed Bill's backup bike and rode with cautious enthusiasm. Henry watched from behind, heart full. When they reached the overlook at the edge of town, where the path opened wide and the city stretched beneath them, glittering, Jeremy turned to him. I see it now, he said. All of it. The tunnel. The rides. The hope. It's real. Henry nodded. It was always there. Just buried. Later that week, a documentary crew from a public television network arrived to film a special on community-led aging innovations. They wanted to feature Henry, the Second Wind movement, and the Tunnel Project, how they intersected to reshape what was possible for cities and the people who lived in them. The director was in her 30s, sharp, fast-talking, but respectful. She asked Henry during the on-camera interview, what does success look like for you now? Henry thought for a long time. Then said, success is waking up and knowing there's still something worth doing. It's when people stop saying, used to be, and start saying, I'm just getting started. The documentary aired nationally 3 weeks later. Viewers wrote in by the thousands. A man in Detroit said he started a book club at his retirement home. A woman in Vermont said she'd lost her husband 2 years ago, but for the first time since, she went out and joined a knitting group at the library. An 88-year-old former teacher in Oklahoma created a YouTube channel called Ask Mrs. May, where she answered questions from teenagers about life, love, and everything in between. The tunnel had become more than concrete and steel. It was metaphor now. Shared language. A symbol of what lies beneath resignation. And how digging through it could lead to something better. One day, Henry received a formal letter from the city. An invitation. They wanted to name a new community pavilion in the Innovation District after him. The Henry Wallace Center for Reinvention. He laughed when he read it. Then cried. It wasn't vanity. It was disbelief. He had spent so many years feeling invisible, like a ghost in his own life. And now a city wanted to etch his name in stone as a reminder that people didn't vanish with age. They transformed. The dedication ceremony was modest but meaningful. Families. Writers. Local officials. Even a few young kids who'd seen the documentary and wanted to meet the tunnel guy. Henry gave a short speech. No notes. Just his heart. He ended with this, if you're 18 or 88, there's still more road. And when you feel like you're buried, remember, maybe you're just planted. Keep growing. That night, Jeremy sat with him on the back porch under a sky thick with stars. "I'm proud of you, Dad," he said. Henry turned, surprised. "You never said that before." Jeremy smiled. "I didn't say it enough. But I'm here now. And I mean it." Henry nodded slowly. "That's what matters. Now." The tunnel rumbled faintly beneath them, the sound of something moving fast underground, silent but sure. Henry listened. Smiled. The sound wasn't loud. But it was constant. Just like hope. Just like purpose. Just like the future. It started, like most revolutions do, in a place no one expected. Not in a boardroom. Not in a think tank. But in a garage. Henry's garage. The same one where he'd fixed up his old bike, where he'd first whispered dreams into the silence, where he'd scribbled blueprints of purpose on the back of envelopes and coffee-stained notepads. It didn't look like much. A workbench on one side. Pegboard with a few tools. Stacks of old shoeboxes that now held more memories than shoes. But this garage, with its flaking paint and creaky door, had become a symbol. It was where the second wind movement was born. People began asking to visit. Not tourists, not fans, builders. Dreamers. Teachers. Plumbers. Grandmothers. Young coders. Retired welders. They wanted to see where it began, where Henry made the pivot from passive waiting to active living. At first, Henry was hesitant. "It's just a garage," he'd say. But they kept coming. And then one day, someone arrived with an idea. Her name was Rachel, 74 years old, retired city planner, and Second Wind chapter leader from Seattle. She stepped into Henry's garage, looked around like it was a cathedral, and said, "We should turn this into a template." Henry blinked. A template for what? For everything. A model. A micro-hub. Think about it, how many garages, basements, spare rooms are sitting empty in this country? What if we turn them into local launch pads? Second wind spaces. Henry crossed his arms, curious. Keep going. Places where people meet. Not formal. Not bureaucratic. Just simple, human spaces for doing things again, fixing, learning, writing, talking. No pressure. Just possibility. Henry looked around his garage and saw it for the first time through her eyes. A map on the wall. A coffee maker. A stack of donated bikes. A shelf of handwritten letters. Blueprints. Guidebooks. Photographs. It wasn't just a garage anymore. It was a lighthouse. Within weeks, they launched the pilot, Garage to Greatness. Second Wind members across the country began submitting photos and short proposals, how they would transform their unused spaces into hubs of purpose. Not big budgets. Not flashy designs. Just tables, chairs, whiteboards, shared vision. The first 5 garages were chosen. 1, a single-car garage in Des Moines, turned into a Legacy Builders meetup site. 2, a backyard shed in Tucson, refurbished into a free bike repair spot. 3, a sunroom in Raleigh, converted into a storytelling lounge called The Porch. 4, a basement in Buffalo, transformed into a weekly skills exchange lab. 5, and a 3-season garage in Oakland, where 2 retired sisters hosted art therapy circles twice a week. Henry visited all 5. Quietly. Not as a celebrity. Just as a fellow builder. He listened. He asked questions. He took notes. Each space buzzed with something that couldn't be measured, call it dignity, maybe. Or rediscovered worth. In Des Moines, a man who hadn't spoken in public in 10 years read his poem aloud for the first time. In Raleigh, a retired nurse taught young moms how to knit. In Tucson, a group of volunteers turned donated bikes into gifts for under-resourced kids. The movement had shape now. Form. Physicality. You could see it, smell it, walk into it. And then came the phone call that changed the trajectory again. A producer from a national morning show had seen the documentary and reached out. She wanted to do a live broadcast, from Henry's garage. "I'm not interested in making you into a star," she said. "I'm interested in showing people what hope looks like when it's built by hand." Henry hesitated. He didn't like cameras. He didn't like the fuss. But he understood the power of visibility. Especially now. So he said yes. The segment aired on a sunny Thursday morning. Henry stood in his garage, wearing a clean button-down, still oil on his fingertips. He walked the camera through the story. Not with rehearsed lines, but real ones. "This is where I started riding again," he said, gesturing to the corner with the bike. "Not because I wanted exercise, but because I wanted to feel something again." He showed the letters, the wall of photos, the shelf of printed second wind manuals. "Every single person who sends me a letter isn't asking for a miracle. They're asking for permission, to dream again. This garage gave me that. And I want others to have the same." The interviewer asked, "What would you say to someone watching this right now who feels too far gone? Too old?" Henry didn't blink. "I'd say, you're not a problem to solve. You're a story to continue. And it's not too late to pick up the pen." That one line went viral. Within 48 hours, the Garage to Greatness portal had over 10,000 inquiries. Local news stations across the country began airing mini-features on retirees who had opened their own community spaces. Some were just 2 folding chairs and a hot plate. Others became workshops, libraries, meeting rooms. It didn't matter how big. What mattered was the heartbeat. People weren't waiting to be useful anymore. They were building use into their lives. One woman in Nebraska turned her husband's old woodworking shed into a space called Repair and Reminisce. She held open hours twice a week, fixing broken chairs while neighbors sat and told stories. A man in Maine cleared out his garage and hosted Sunday Soup and Stories, where anyone over 60 could show up, eat a bowl of soup, and share a memory. A retired software engineer in San Diego opened a coding lab in his 2-car garage, teaching local teens how to build websites and apps, completely free. It was a revolution, all right. A quiet, stubborn, garage-born revolution of purpose. And Henry? He kept showing up. Not as a figurehead. As a participant. A witness. A man who knew the value of unfinished business. He wrote essays, gave talks, and kept writing every Sunday. One night, after a virtual panel on urban innovation and aging, he sat in his garage alone and whispered aloud, "This is bigger than me." And for the first time, he felt no fear in that. Because revolutions don't need heroes. They need ignition. And this movement of repurposed spaces, rewritten legacies, and rediscovered fire, had plenty. They didn't wear capes. They wore sweatshirts. Orthopedic shoes. Reading glasses. They didn't storm palaces. They opened garage doors. They didn't demand youth. They demanded meaning. And somehow, through it all, Henry had become not just a founder, but a gardener. Tending to the soil of belief, pruning what no longer served, and watching, with quiet awe, as a field of late-blooming stories took root across the country. Not because of fame. Not because of money. But because somewhere deep in the noise of modern life, someone had whispered, "What if I'm not done yet?" And others had answered, "Neither am I." Henry sat still in the doctor's office, the paper on the exam table crinkling under him as he adjusted his posture. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and something colder, something clinical. He'd come in for what he thought was a minor checkup. Just a nagging ache in his side that hadn't gone away in a few weeks. Probably nothing, he figured. But as Dr. Lansing looked over his scan results, her lips pressed into a line. She wasn't the kind to sugarcoat. And that's what he liked about her. Still, he didn't expect her next words. We found a shadow on your kidney, Henry. It's small, but it's something we need to look into. Time froze. The hum of the fluorescent light seemed louder. Henry blinked slowly, nodding, as if absorbing the impact like he had trained for it. A shadow, he repeated. What kind of shadow? We won't know until we biopsy it, she said, gentle but firm. It could be benign. Or not. But we'll move fast, okay? Fast. That word meant something different to Henry now. He had spent a year rebuilding his life on the idea that there was still time, that motion meant meaning. And now he was being told that something inside him, something he hadn't even noticed, might be quietly plotting against all of that. He left the clinic without telling anyone. No phone calls. No updates. He rode his bike, not to exercise, but to think. The wind pressed hard against his face as he pedaled through the quiet streets, cutting through the town like he was the only one awake. He stopped at the overlook, the same one he had stood on with Jeremy not long ago, and dismounted. The city twinkled beneath him. Somewhere below, the tunnel rumbled with its quiet efficiency, moving people and ideas through its subterranean arteries. A tunnel. That's what the doctor had called it once, the circulatory system. A network of tunnels under the skin. Henry sat on the bench and exhaled, slowly. Was this how it ended? No, he thought. Not yet. He wasn't afraid of dying. Not exactly. He was afraid of dying unfinished. Of leaving the work half done. Of the revolution stalling because the man who lit the first match stepped away too soon. But that fear gave way to something else, clarity. The next morning, Henry wrote 3 letters. One to Emily, whatever happens, no, this isn't the end. It's a turn in the path. One to Jeremy, I'm proud of the man you've become. Let's not let fear steal time from us again. And one to himself, you don't have to be immortal. Just unforgettable. The biopsy came quickly. The results slower. He didn't tell the second wind riders. Not yet. He kept showing up. Kept writing. Kept building. He helped a group in Kansas City open their first, second wind studio, in a refurbished shipping container. He mentored a woman in Alaska via Zoom who was turning her retirement home's laundry room into a poetry club. But at night, the weight pressed harder. Not the fear, but the urgency. He began outlining what he called the legacy drop. A system of video messages, essays, and letters to be released over time, not just in case he passed, but to give people something more permanent to hold on to. Not instructions. Not doctrine. Just reminders. Of the truth he had discovered. The truth he wanted no one to forget. That movement didn't need youth. It needed motion. That purpose wasn't a luxury. It was oxygen. That being too late was the greatest lie ever told. Each day, he recorded one piece. In the garage, in the park, on the trail. Sometimes with others. Sometimes alone. He called them chapters from the tunnel. Because that's what this journey had become. A slow dig through everything buried, fears, regrets, dreams deferred, until something raw and human emerged on the other side. Finally, the call came. Dr. Lansing. Her voice steady. It's early stage. Contained. Very treatable. Henry exhaled, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter. But we need to act. Surgery, then a short course of treatment. If we move now, your prognosis is excellent. It was strange. The idea that something so terrifying could be met with relief, gratitude even. He thanked her. Not with flowery words. Just with that quiet steadiness he had learned to carry. The next day, he told the riders. He stood in front of them before their weekly loop and said, "I'm going offline for a bit. Not forever. Just for healing." They looked at him, not with fear or pity, but with pride. Because they knew. He wasn't stepping away. He was stepping back, like an architect checking the frame of a house he'd built. "You're allowed to rest," Bill said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Even tunnel diggers need water breaks." They laughed. They hugged. And then they rode, in his honor, in his name, in the spirit of motion he had taught them to love. Surgery went well. Henry recovered slower than he liked, but with patience. Emily stayed with him the first week. Jeremy flew in for the second. They sat on the porch each night, sipping tea, talking about nothing and everything. "You know," Jeremy said one evening, "when I was younger, I always thought you were distant. Cold, even." "I was scared," Henry said. "Scared of not being enough. Scared of being seen too closely." Jeremy nodded. "And now?" "Now I want to be transparent," Henry said. "Like glass. Let the light through." When he returned to the second wind group a month later, he was thinner, a little paler, but smiling. They welcomed him with open arms, no fanfare. Just motion. A ride. A ride that felt like rebirth. During that ride, something strange happened. They passed the new second wind pavilion, where a group of teenagers was gathered around a bench. As Henry passed, one of the kids called out, "Hey, aren't you the tunnel guy?" Henry chuckled. "I suppose I am." "We're doing a school project on you," the kid said. "About how cities and people both need second chances." Henry slowed, surprised. "And what have you learned?" "That if something's buried, you dig," the boy replied, without missing a beat. Henry laughed, a real, full laugh. The kind that shakes loose the fear. That night, he wrote one last video message. Not for release after death. But for today. He sat in his garage, the light soft behind him, and looked into the lens. "I used to think reinvention was for the young. That it had to be loud, fast, and filled with drama. But now I know the truth, reinvention can be quiet. Gentle. It can happen in a single choice, to keep moving, to keep caring, to keep hoping." He paused, then added, "If you're watching this, you're alive. That's your permission slip. Go build something. Go repair something. Go say something that scares you. Go become someone your past self would admire." He looked at the camera for a long moment. "The tunnel under our skin is long. Winding. And sometimes scary. But it's never too late to come out the other side. I did. And you can, too." Then he clicked the record button off. And for the first time in weeks, he didn't feel afraid. He felt free. It started with a vibration. Not a metaphor. Not a feeling. A real vibration. Faint, steady, coming up through the soles of Henry's shoes as he stood on the observation deck above the tunnel entrance. He was there alone that morning, coffee in one hand, the other resting on the glass railing. The innovation district was quiet at this hour, still stretching awake. Below, the tunnel pulsed with life, the sleek electric transports gliding silently along the invisible track beneath the city. It wasn't the movement that surprised him. It was the sound. Or rather, what was being said. The new vehicles, Musk's next-gen design, had integrated AI audio messaging now. Not advertising, not news, but curated voices, stories, and quotes that played softly as people rode. The goal, according to the project team, was to make the ride not just efficient, but meaningful. A moving meditation, they'd called it. What Henry heard drifting up from the tunnel wasn't random. It was his own voice. "You're not too old. You're just underutilized. And maybe, just maybe, it's time to reroute. His eyes widened. That was from his first community talk, long before the TEDx moment, before the booklets, before the movement had a name. He leaned closer to the glass, heart thudding. Another line floated up, carried like a whisper through a vent. Retirement isn't the end of the road. It's the start of a different map. He stood there, stunned. Part of him embarrassed. Part of him honored. And all of him aware that this wasn't just sound. It was impact, reflected back. The tunnel, Elon's tunnel, was now speaking in his voice. His story. Later that day, Henry called Emily. "Did you know they put my words into the tunnel ride audio?" She laughed. "You didn't read the memo, did you?" "What memo?" "The team reached out weeks ago. I gave them permission to use some of your talks. They said the passengers love hearing something human, especially on such a futuristic ride. And your voice, well, it's like warm flannel and courage." Henry shook his head, amused. "You snuck that past me." "It wasn't sneaky," she replied. "It was legacy." Word spread quickly. People started recording snippets of the tunnel messages, tagging Henry online. A woman posted a video of her grandmother crying as she listened to the line, "You're not invisible. You're just early to your second act." A man wrote in saying he'd heard Henry's voice during his ride to a job interview he never thought he'd land. He got the job, and said the voice talked me out of quitting halfway there. And so began what the media called the tunnel whisper. It became a sort of spiritual feature of the transport experience. New phrases were added weekly. Some from Henry, some from other voices that had joined the second wind movement. There were quotes from librarians, retired dancers, ex-factory workers turned poets. Every voice carried one truth: relevance doesn't retire. One week, Elon himself appeared virtually at a second wind live stream, offering his own version of the idea. "We dig tunnels through cities to bypass traffic," he said. What Henry reminded us is that we can dig tunnels through mindsets to bypass limitation. Henry watched from his garage, the live stream flickering on his old laptop, and smiled. "Now that's a good quote," he muttered. Soon after, the city unveiled an idea that felt both surreal and perfectly logical: they would create a living library within the Second Wind Pavilion. Not of books. Of people. Elders could volunteer to be scheduled for story hours, where members of the public, especially youth, could sign up to sit with them and ask questions, hear stories, learn real history from real voices. It was inspired by something that had happened organically at the pavilion. A 17-year-old named Malik had interviewed Henry for a school project, and then brought back 2 friends, and then 5 more, just to listen. "I'd never heard someone talk about age like that," Malik had said. He didn't sound like someone looking back. He sounded like someone still in it. So they built a system. A roster. A schedule. A space with soft lighting, comfortable chairs, a teapot always on. The living library was born. Henry was the first listed speaker, but far from the last. People came from surrounding towns to share their chapters. A former jazz pianist taught teens how to improvise both music and life. A retired machinist explained the art of patience through gears. A former civil rights marcher told stories of fear and courage, leaving listeners breathless. The tunnel below continued to hum, the city above continued to evolve, and in that small space between technology and tradition, something remarkable was happening. Henry, meanwhile, was dreaming again. He wanted to take the idea national. A mobile version of the living library. An Airstream trailer retrofitted into a storytelling studio. It could travel from town to town, from nursing home to high school, capturing voices before they disappeared into silence. He called it the Rolling Archive. Jeremy helped him design it. Emily helped him write the grants. Musk's team even offered to donate a solar-charged battery system to keep it powered off-grid. The first test run happened on a windy Tuesday. Henry and Emily drove to a small town 2 hours away where a community center had been scheduled for interviews. They parked the trailer out front, opened the doors, and invited people in. That day, they recorded 7 life stories. A 93-year-old farmer who had never flown in a plane but remembered watching the first moon landing on a black-and-white TV. A woman who had been the first female mechanic in her county. A retired school principal who once taught 4 generations of one family. Henry sat in the corner, headphones on, listening and logging each tale. "This," he whispered, "this is what gets lost when people think old means done." That night, he stood outside the trailer, looking up at the stars. The tunnel rumbled faintly in the distance, hidden beneath concrete, but alive in its own way. He thought of something Elon had said once, during a podcast interview: "We don't build tunnels just to go faster. We build them because the surface is too crowded with noise." Henry got it now. That wasn't just about cars. That was about stories. About lives. He had lived most of his years thinking he was part of the background. And now, here he was, with his voice playing in a futuristic tunnel, his story being told back to him through strangers, his idea rolling down highways in a silver trailer covered in hand-painted stars. The future wasn't something that belonged to the young. It belonged to the living. And as long as he had breath, he was going to keep riding toward it. One slow pedal at a time. The day started like any other. Henry sat at his kitchen table, the soft morning light streaming through the window, casting long shadows across his notes. He was working on the script for the next video in his Legacy Drop series when the mail arrived. An ordinary brown envelope, heavier than expected, addressed in a neat, unmistakable handwriting: Henry Wallace. His hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed but signed in sharp black ink at the bottom: Elon Musk. The name alone made his heart race. Elon Musk, the man who had sparked his entire transformation, whose tunnel project had become the symbol of hope for so many, had taken the time to write to him. Henry read the letter slowly, the words unfolding like a secret bridge connecting 2 worlds. "Dear Henry," it began. "Your work has become a quiet revolution. I hear your voice every time I descend into the tunnel. It reminds me that technology means nothing without humanity to guide it. I'm writing not just to thank you, but to invite you to something, an event we're calling the Future Forum. A gathering of thinkers, doers, and dreamers from all walks of life. We want you there. To speak. To inspire. To remind us all that the future is built by those who refuse to accept limits. Let me know if you can come." Henry sat back, absorbing the weight of the letter. Invitations like this were the stuff of dreams, or nightmares, depending on the day. Speaking in front of tech elites, billionaires, and media giants was a different world from his small-town talks. Yet, deep down, he felt ready. Ready to bring the stories of the second wind riders, the living library, the rolling archive, to a stage where maybe, just maybe, they could echo farther than any tunnel or video ever could. He called Emily immediately. "Elon Musk invited me to the Future Forum." Emily laughed through the phone. "I knew it was only a matter of time before the whole world caught up with us. You're going to be brilliant." Jeremy, when told, was quieter, but supportive. "You're going to remind them what matters. Not the gadgets, but the people." Henry accepted the invitation. What followed was a whirlwind. Preparation meetings via Zoom. Interviews with the event producers who wanted to highlight his message as the heartbeat of the forum. He wrote and rewrote his speech. He practiced standing tall, speaking slowly, feeling the weight of the room before him. The day of the Future Forum arrived on a brisk autumn morning in California. Henry stepped off the plane, his old leather jacket wrapped tight against the chill. The sprawling campus buzzed with energy, robots delivering coffee, solar arrays shimmering on rooftops, screens everywhere streaming data, ideas, visions of tomorrow. He was led backstage, greeted by a team that knew exactly who he was, but treated him with the warmth of old friends. Elon himself appeared briefly, a quick nod, a smile, a whispered, "Welcome." When Henry walked onto the stage, the room fell into a hush. He felt the weight of hundreds of eyes and ears trained on him, but also something else, the weight of every person who had ever felt invisible because of age or circumstance. The fear that had once held him frozen melted away into something fierce and alive. He began simply. "What if I told you the future isn't just for the young? That every day lived is an opportunity to rewrite the map, to dig a new tunnel when the old one collapses? I'm here because I was told I was too old to change. But I'm here to tell you, that's the greatest lie we tell ourselves." He told them about the second wind riders, the living library, the rolling archive. He shared stories from elders who had become the city's greatest teachers, from teenagers who had rediscovered wonder through the voices of those who had walked before them. He spoke of fear and courage, of loss and reclamation, of the quiet revolution that happens when someone refuses to fade. The room was silent for a long moment after he finished. Then came the applause, slow, deliberate, growing until it filled every corner of the hall. Elon returned to the stage, shaking Henry's hand. "That," Elon said, "is the future we need." That night, at the after-party under strings of lights and a sky full of stars, Henry found himself surrounded by a new kind of community. Innovators and artists, thinkers and builders, all eager to hear more about the human stories behind the tech headlines. A young woman approached him and said, "Your words gave me permission to start my own project. To work beyond what I thought was possible." Henry smiled, feeling the truth of Elon's words. That the future was built by those who refused to accept limits. When he returned home, he felt different. Not younger, not invincible, but empowered. He was reminded that the tunnel wasn't just a metaphor for change. It was a living symbol of connection, between people, across generations, beyond the fear of what "too late" might mean. He sat down to write a new letter, to the writers, the living library volunteers, the rolling archive contributors. "We're just getting started," he wrote. "The future is ours, no matter our age. Let's keep digging." And with that, Henry Wallace, once a man who thought he was finished, stepped fully into the light of his second act, ready to build tunnels that would carry hope for generations to come. Henry stared at the sleek envelope resting on his kitchen counter, the glossy black paper shimmering under the afternoon light like a secret waiting to be unlocked. It was the kind of envelope you only saw once in a lifetime. Simple, elegant, and bearing no return address except a small embossed symbol, the logo of SpaceX. His hands trembled as he reached for it, feeling a mix of disbelief and hope swirling inside him. He carefully slid the card out, unfolded it, and read the words printed in bold, futuristic type: "You are invited to visit the Hyperloop test facility in Nevada. Witness the future of transportation. Your story is part of ours." Henry blinked. Elon Musk's world was always a place of extremes, the impossible made possible, the future arriving faster than anyone expected. Yet here he was, a 67-year-old man who had spent the last year reinventing himself and his community, being pulled deeper into that orbit. The invitation felt less like a gesture and more like a call to adventure. He called Emily immediately, his voice cracking with excitement. "They want me to visit the Hyperloop test track," he said. "Can you believe it?" Emily chuckled, sensing the significance beyond the words. "It's not just a visit, Henry. It's a sign. You're becoming part of something bigger." Jeremy was skeptical at first. "The Hyperloop? That sounds like sci-fi. But if anyone can show us it's real, it's Elon. Just don't forget your helmet." Henry laughed and promised to bring his best questions and his most open mind. The day of the trip arrived. Henry boarded a private shuttle with a handful of other invitees, engineers, community leaders, a few journalists. The shuttle hummed softly as it soared over desert landscapes, mountains rolling in the distance, dust kicking up in the dry wind. The test facility itself was a sprawling complex of gleaming metal tubes stretching for miles, futuristic pods waiting patiently inside. When Elon greeted them, his energy was electric, his ideas flowing as quickly as the wind outside. "We're building tunnels to connect cities in minutes," he said. "But it's not just about speed. It's about transforming how we think of space, time, and community." Henry nodded, feeling the familiar spark Elon's words always ignited. They toured the control center, watched test runs of the pods, and then Elon invited Henry into the driver's seat of one of the simulators. As Henry took hold of the controls, feeling the acceleration and gravity simulated in the pod, he realized how much this moment symbolized, stepping into new territory, pushing beyond boundaries he'd once thought were set in stone. But what stayed with him after the thrill of speed was the conversation with Elon in a quiet corner of the facility. "Your work with the second wind movement," Elon said, "is exactly what this future needs. Technology without heart is just noise. You remind us why we build." Henry smiled, feeling the warmth of that recognition. For so long, he'd felt like an afterthought, an invisible cog in a rapidly changing world. Now, he was becoming a vital thread in the fabric of tomorrow. Back home, Henry reflected on the day. The tunnel beneath his city, the living library, the rolling archive, all were ripples in a larger current that was sweeping across the country, maybe even the world. He began drafting a new plan, a partnership between the Second Wind movement and Elon's Hyperloop initiative. Imagine elders and young people traveling together between cities, sharing stories on the go, breaking down walls of isolation and misunderstanding. He presented the idea to the riders and volunteers at the next weekly meeting. They listened, eyes bright with possibility. "We're not just building tunnels under cities," Henry said. "We're building tunnels between hearts." The following months were a blur of calls, meetings, and planning. Jeremy helped design a mobile app that allowed riders to connect, share stories, and schedule meetups. Emily coordinated with local governments and nonprofits to secure funding and support. Henry traveled to several cities to speak about the initiative, weaving Elon's vision with his own message of resilience and hope. The project gained momentum. Media outlets picked up the story, "From Hyperloop to Heartloop," a headline read. The movement that started in a small town was now a national phenomenon, inspiring countless others to rethink what aging meant. Henry never forgot the moment when the first group of elders and youth boarded a Hyperloop pod together, traveling from one city to another. They laughed, exchanged stories, sang songs, and forged bonds that transcended generations. The tunnel, both literal and metaphorical, had finally spoken back. As Henry watched the sun set over the test track that evening, he realized something profound: the future wasn't a distant place. It was a bridge built from every choice made today. And he, who once thought his story was nearly finished, was now a vital architect of that bridge. Henry's mailbox was no stranger to letters. Over the past year, it had been filled with notes from supporters, invitations to speak, and even a few skeptical postcards from strangers doubting the value of a man his age trying to change the world. But one afternoon, among the usual stack, a letter stood out, handwritten, with no return address, the ink slightly smudged as if it had traveled a long way. He tore it open with curious hands. "Dear Mr. Wallace," it began, "I'm 73 years old, living in a small town in Iowa. I have no fancy titles or big plans, but I want to thank you for your courage. Your story gave me the strength to start my own project, a community garden where neighbors of all ages come together. We call it the Second Wind Garden. It's small, but it's growing. Just like hope. Keep digging tunnels. Maggie." Henry read the letter twice, then 3 times. Tears blurred the words on the page. It was a simple letter, yet its impact was profound. This wasn't just about him anymore. His story, his work, was lighting fires in people he would never meet, sparking change far beyond his city, beyond the tunnel beneath his feet. He shared the letter with Emily and Jeremy. "This is why we keep going," he said quietly. That night, Henry sat in his favorite chair, the glow of his laptop casting soft light on the room. He decided to start a new series called Letters from the Second Wind, where he would read letters like Maggie's aloud, sharing the voices of everyday heroes reclaiming their futures. The first video, uploaded to his channel, quickly went viral. Comments poured in, stories of second chances, late-life adventures, new friendships formed. One message caught Henry's eye. It was from a man named Carlos, a retired factory worker from Detroit. "Your story made me dust off my toolbox and fix up the old community center. Now it's a place for kids and seniors to learn together. Thank you for showing me it's never too late." Henry replied, inviting Carlos to join the Second Wind network. Soon, a patchwork quilt of communities began forming: gardens, workshops, art collectives, and mentoring circles, all inspired by the idea that age was not a barrier but a beginning. Meanwhile, Elon's tunnel project continued to expand, the city beneath Henry's feet becoming a hub of innovation and connection. The tunnel wasn't just a path for transportation, it was a conduit for stories, for hope, for the relentless human spirit. And Henry was at the center of it all. At a Second Wind event, Henry stood before a crowd that had grown from dozens to hundreds. Faces of all ages looked up at him, shining with expectation. He felt a surge of energy as he spoke about Maggie's letter and the ripple effect of courage. "We're digging tunnels not just through earth, but through doubt, fear, and loneliness," he said. "Every letter, every story, is a brick in this tunnel, a path forward for all of us." After the speech, an unexpected visitor approached him, an elderly woman with bright eyes and a warm smile. "Henry, I'm Maggie," she said softly. "Your work brought us together in Iowa. I wanted to meet the man who reminded us we're still needed." They embraced, a moment heavy with meaning. Henry realized then that the legacy he sought was already alive, in gardens, in letters, in shared laughter across miles. The movement was no longer just his story. It was theirs. And together, they were digging tunnels that would carry hope far beyond what anyone had imagined. Henry woke to an unusual quiet. The usual hum of the city, the honking cars, distant sirens, the early morning chatter, was missing. He looked out his window, expecting to see the first stirrings of his small town coming to life. But the streets were empty. Not just a little quiet, but completely still, as if the city itself had paused its breath. A headline flashed on his phone: "Citywide transit halted, tunnel system suspended indefinitely." His heart sank. The news explained that a critical malfunction in the newly constructed tunnels beneath the city had forced an emergency shutdown. Safety concerns were paramount, they said, but the abruptness of the closure sent shockwaves through the community. For many, the tunnels had become a symbol of hope and renewal, a literal and figurative pathway to a new future. Now, that future seemed to be slipping away. Henry felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The tunnel was more than concrete and steel. It was the lifeline for the Second Wind movement, the thread connecting generations, the place where his own transformation had begun. He knew that if the tunnel failed, it would deal a devastating blow to everyone who had dared to dream beyond the limitations of age. He grabbed his jacket and headed to the community center, where the riders, volunteers, and local leaders had gathered. The room buzzed with tension and uncertainty. Faces that had once shone with optimism were now clouded with doubt. "We can't let this stop us," Henry said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. The tunnel was a symbol, yes, but it was also a spark. And sparks don't die because the wind blows harder. They grow. Emily stepped forward with a plan. "We'll organize volunteer patrols to keep the tunnels safe and clean while the engineers work. We'll hold town halls to keep everyone informed. And most importantly, we'll remind each other why we started this, because every one of us matters." The crowd nodded, a flicker of hope returning. Over the next days, Henry found himself at the heart of a grassroots movement to save the tunnels. He met with city officials, engineers, and community members, pressing for transparency and solutions. He documented everything for his channel, turning the crisis into a story of resilience rather than defeat. One evening, as he walked the dimly lit tunnels with a small group of volunteers, he felt a surge of emotion. The walls around them were cracked and weathered in places, but the air was still charged with possibility. They placed handwritten notes along the tunnel walls, messages of encouragement, poems, drawings from children and elders alike. The tunnel became a gallery of hope, a testament to the community's refusal to give up. Elon Musk himself sent a message to Henry. "Challenges like this test us," it read. "But remember, every great leap forward has moments of setback. Keep leading the charge." Those words were balm to Henry's weary spirit. He realized the tunnel's true power wasn't in its technology but in the community it had inspired, the people who refused to let fear dictate their future. Weeks turned into months. Repairs were made, safety protocols enhanced. Slowly, the tunnels reopened, greeted by cheers and celebrations. But the real victory was something deeper. A renewed sense of purpose, a recognition that progress is never a straight line. Henry stood at the station one crisp morning, watching a group of elders and teenagers board a pod together. Their laughter echoed through the platform, a sound that carried the promise of new beginnings. The city was moving again, but more importantly, so were its people. That day, Henry understood something he hadn't before: true transformation wasn't about avoiding failure, it was about rising each time you fell, stronger and more determined than before. Henry sat quietly in the dim light of his study, the worn leather of his favorite chair creaking softly beneath him. Outside, the city buzzed with life, the tunnels humming with renewed energy, yet inside, he grappled with a silence that felt heavier than ever. For all the progress, all the hope and connection, there was still a voice he hadn't heard, a voice that belonged to him, the one buried under years of doubt and the noise of a world rushing past. He pulled out an old journal, its pages yellowed and fragile, and flipped through memories of dreams long abandoned. There was a time when he'd wanted to be a writer, to tell stories that mattered, but life had steered him down other paths: work, family, survival. The idea that he could still share his voice, inspire others, had felt impossible. Until recently. Inspired by Elon Musk's relentless pursuit of the impossible, Henry had started writing again, but this time, the words were different, raw, honest, unapologetic. He poured his fears, hopes, and lessons into essays and letters, sharing them online. Slowly, those words found their way into hearts far beyond his small town. One evening, as he was preparing a new essay titled "The Tunnel Within," an email popped into his inbox. The subject line read, "Your voice changed my life." Curious, he opened it. "Dear Henry, I'm a former teacher from Ohio. For years, I felt invisible, retired, alone, like my time had passed. Then I found your videos and essays. You reminded me that age is a door, not a wall. I started writing again, sharing my stories with local students. They call me the storyteller now. Thank you for showing me I still have a voice. Margaret." Tears welled in Henry's eyes. Margaret's story mirrored his own, a reminder that the journey wasn't just his but a collective awakening. He replied, and soon, a correspondence began. Margaret shared her stories, her challenges, and her triumphs. Henry realized that the movement was evolving. It wasn't just about tunnels or technology, but about reclaiming the power of voice and narrative at any age. He proposed an idea, a national storytelling project, connecting elders and youth through shared tales, both written and spoken. Elon's team offered technical support, providing a platform to amplify these voices through podcasts and virtual gatherings. The first live session was electric. Henry watched as Margaret read a story about her childhood during the Great Depression, her voice steady and clear. On the other end, teenagers listened with rapt attention, asking questions, drawing parallels to their own lives. It was a bridge across generations, a living archive of wisdom and resilience. Henry's own voice grew stronger with each session. He found healing in the act of sharing, and power in listening. He realized that the forgotten voices weren't gone, they were waiting, like seeds beneath the soil, ready to bloom when given light. One afternoon, as Henry walked through the city park, a young woman approached him. "Mr. Wallace," she said shyly, "I'm part of the youth group that listens to your stories. You've changed how we see our grandparents, and ourselves. Thank you for giving us this gift." Henry smiled, his heart full. The tunnels beneath the city weren't just paths through the earth, they were echoes of voices once thought lost, now singing together in harmony. He sat back in his chair, the journal open once more. The journey was far from over. The voice he thought was forgotten had found its echo, and together, they would continue to build a legacy of connection, courage, and endless possibility. Henry stood at the edge of the tunnel entrance, the soft glow of dawn casting long shadows across the platform. The air smelled faintly of earth and metal, a reminder of all the labor and hope that had gone into creating this place. Around him, familiar faces, friends, neighbors, even strangers, gathered in quiet anticipation. This was no longer just a tunnel beneath a city, it was a symbol of rebirth, a testament to resilience, and a beacon of possibility for everyone who thought their story was over. The journey that had begun with a moment of doubt, a spark from Elon Musk's daring vision, had led to this, a community transformed, lives rekindled, and a future reimagined. Henry looked out at the crowd, feeling the weight and the wonder of it all settle deep in his bones. He remembered the days when he felt invisible, like time had passed him by and left him behind. The doctor's warnings to slow down, the skeptical glances from his children, the endless nights wrestling with the question, is it too late? Those moments seemed so distant now, softened by the light of everything he and his community had built. Elon Musk's tunnel wasn't just a marvel of engineering, it was a metaphor for the human spirit. Like that tunnel, Henry's life had been dark and uncertain beneath the surface, but he had kept digging. He had carved out space for new dreams, new connections, and new legacies. And now, standing among those who had taken that journey with him, he understood something fundamental. The end of one chapter was only the beginning of the next. The crowd hushed as Henry stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We thought this was the end, of our energy, our relevance, our dreams. But it wasn't. This tunnel, this movement, this community, these are our new beginnings. We were never too old to matter. We were just waiting for permission to matter again." He paused, letting the words sink in. Eyes glistened with tears, smiles blossomed like flowers in spring, and hands found one another in quiet solidarity. "Every day is a choice," Henry continued. "A choice to keep moving forward, to build bridges instead of walls, to light sparks that can ignite change. We are the proof that transformation is possible at any age. And our story is far from over." As he spoke, a soft melody began to rise from the crowd, songs from the elders, harmonizing with voices of the young. The tunnel pulsed with life, a living artery of hope and courage. Later, as Henry walked through the tunnel with Emily and Jeremy, he marveled at the murals painted by local artists, the benches carved with inscriptions of wisdom, the laughter spilling from every corner. It was a living museum of what could happen when fear gave way to faith, when doubt surrendered to determination. Elon's voice echoed in his memory, "Keep pushing boundaries. The future belongs to those who refuse to be limited." Henry smiled. He wasn't just a passenger on this journey, he was one of the drivers. And the road ahead, though uncertain, was wide open. That night, Henry sat by his window, watching the city lights flicker like stars. He reached for his journal, writing the last words of his story, "I was never too old. I was just waiting for permission to matter again. Now, I give that permission to all of us. The future is ours to create." And with that, he closed the book, not as an ending, but as a promise. A new beginning for himself and for all who dare to dream beyond the limits of age. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?